You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. Welcome to Mysteries and Monsters. Firstly, thank you for all the kind comments regarding last week's show with Linda. I've received comments from across the world, which just amazes me. Well, we've got another big guest for you this week, as I'm delighted to be joined by Lyle Blackburn. Lyle's latest book, Sinister Swamps, Monsters and Mysteries of the Mire, has just been released, and I loved it. Lyle's books are consistently excellent, so I was delighted to discuss a couple of frankly terrifying areas in the States, including the infamous Hockomock Swamp, and we also go deep on the trail of the Honey Island Swamp Monster. One of the pleasures of doing this show is speaking with people who I have so much respect for and the level of investigation that they do, and there is no doubt that Lyle is one of the best. This is Lyle's third appearance, so I hope you enjoyed the show as much as we did discussing the Sinister Swamps. It's also one of those weeks when some great new books drop on my doormat. From the latest release from Shannon and Jeff's Beyond the Fray Publishing, Paramalgamation, Malcolm Robinson's latest The Sochi Poltergeist, Max Brooks's Killer Bigfoot story Devolution, and I've also landed Chad Lewis and Kevin Lee Nelson's terrifying Wendigo Lore. I think that'll keep me busy for a while. Mysteries and Monsters has also found a new sports team to follow. The mighty Loch Ness FC. The club have been inundated with orders for their fantastic new football kits, both featuring Nessie. We've ordered one, and if you want to grab what is sure to become a collector's item and a super cool shirt, you need to head over to lochnessfc.co.uk to get one before they sell out. We'll be cheering them on in the new season, and I suggest most cryptozoologists will also start following Loch Ness FC. All the best for the new season, guys. Our latest Patreon episode with micro-cryptozoologist Carl Marshall dropped last week. So if you want to be terrified with tales of the crazy Angolan baboon tarantula and much more, you can sign up for just $4 a month. You'll get exclusive interviews, articles, and every single Patreon member will be entered into a monthly draw for exclusive Patreon-only merchandise. Check the link in the show notes to sign up today. Don't forget, you can find us across all social media platforms, as well as being part of the Straight Up Strange network. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on YouTube, which keeps growing week on week. And you can always drop me a line via social media or email me personally at mysteriesandmonsters@gmail.com. Right. Grab your flashlights, bring your camping gear, and let's join Lyle Blackburn for a journey into some sinister swamps. Joining me today is author and investigator Lyle Blackburn to discuss his fantastic new book, Sinister Swamps, Monsters and Mysteries of the Mire. Lyle's book takes us deep into these unusual places, recounting the experiences, legends and lore of some of North America's most infamous swamps. Lyle, welcome back to Mysteries and Monsters. How are we?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. Now, last time we spoke, at the beginning of the year, you tentatively teased your next book that was coming out, as I've mentioned there, Sinister Swamps. I've had it for about a month now, read it a couple of times. What a fabulous book, especially for somebody like me who's not a native to the US. It's always interesting to get books like this that take me to areas of the US that I've only briefly heard about and touched on. So, was this just a natural progression from the time hanging around Boggy Creek, Lyle, or was it something that's always been... Because I know when you do your introduction, you mention a family trip as a child that kind of captured your imagination. So is it something that's been burning away for a long time for you to dive into?
It kind of has. I mean, I think it sort of goes hand in hand with Boggy Creek. And one of the reasons I liked the Falk Monster Boggy Creek case was because it's sort of in a backwoods, swampy area. But, you know, in general, I've always just had an affinity for swamps, I think, just in terms of a childhood fascination and the creepy aspect of it, ever since I can remember being a kid. If I saw, horror movies and there was always a swamp, or maybe even Scooby-Doo episodes, they always had the haunted house was always next to a swamp. And for whatever reason, I just, thought it was cool. And living here in Texas, while we do have a lot of swamps, at the time when I was a kid, I had no idea, and I'd never seen a real swamp. So it was sort of like, that's where dinosaurs live and that's where monsters live. So I just always fascinated with it. And as I began to research cryptids and paranormal type stuff, oftentimes, these things occurred on the edge of swamps or within swamps and, spooky environments like that. So once I got finished with the release of my first book, Beast of Boggy Creek, I did what any rational person would do. I went on what I called the swamp tour. And I went around to a lot of places in the southeast United States where there was significant swamplands, and the area had an extensive history of legends and strange encounters of all sorts of beasts and other things. And that kind of ended up resulting in this book. Over the years, as I've visited more of these places or just kind of fielded some reports, I would just sort of put them away and file them, as, okay, this was in a swamp, this was in this swamp or near a swamp. And so the book has literally developed over probably 8 years' time, at least.
I mean, it is interesting because, obviously, probably 2 or 3 of these places are probably more well known because the book's broken down into 10 sections, Lyle. So you've got 9 particular areas that I would imagine anybody with an interest in weird things and cryptids probably knows of a couple of them, primarily more to do with the cryptids that have come out of them. And then obviously you've got a section that does a roundup on a couple of other places with less kind of weird things happening, but still pretty weird. So was it difficult to kind of trim it down to focus on these particular areas? Did you find that you had too much going on in certain places?
Yeah, it was kind of hard to, organize it in a way that it's not too confusing or just jumping around all over the map. So, first and foremost, I chose swamps in North America that were usually infamous or had a significant amount of history with cryptids or other paranormal activity. Hockomock Swamp, Honey Island, Okefenokee. These were places that, could encompass a whole chapter. So I kind of broke it down by the main swamps could, fill out an entire chapter. And then towards the end of the book, there's some chapters that kind of incorporate other either smaller swamps or ones that didn't have as much, ongoing activity. But that way I could kind of go from one swamp to another and not just generally jump around. And I think that makes the book, readable and somewhat travelogue because, like you say, you live certainly a great distance from where these occurred. But I always try to take the reader there by describing the place. And many of these swamps I've been to personally, so I can give you that firsthand impression that I got. And to try to, bring the reader along with this journey.
I mean, it is, like, as you touch on there is a lot of, and more than a nod to a travelogue, because it's very interesting, and as you touched on there when you were on about your inspirations, Lyle, I'm the same kind of thing, because obviously I've seen countless films, and there are numerous old black and white movies where strange and dangerous creatures lurk in the edges of swamps, and people should never go wandering there alone or at night in case of what they come into. So they've always had this kind of air of mystery and menace about them, and I think it's a dual thing because obviously these are very dangerous places more than anything because you simply don't understand. The terrain can change in footsteps, really. You could be walking on solid ground and then find yourself thinking you're walking on... I mean, there's a wonderful picture in your book where you point out it looks like it's solid ground, but it's actually like weeds on water, isn't it?
Yes, that is one of the bayous between Texas and Louisiana, and it's a good illustration of that very fact that these are rather dangerous places. And that photo, just totally looks like almost like dirt or ground because the weeds had turned brown. but it's completely water. I mean, it's probably, I don't know how deep it is right there, maybe 8 feet or something. But yeah, it's very deceptive. And while swamps are quite beautiful, and majestic, and you can take some really great pictures, when it comes sundown, and if it's foggy or rainy or it gets dark, it becomes a place of menace and a place where truly, man is not necessarily the apex predator.
Very true, because not only do you have to worry about the terrain, there are plenty of critters there, regardless of these cryptids that are lurking there. You have to keep your eye out for numerous creatures, from alligators to snakes to all sorts.
Oh, certainly so, and I'm usually much less frightened by the possibility of running into, a Bigfoot or a phantom dog than I am a cottonmouth, water moccasin, or what have you, because those are definitely there, and I've seen some areas where they're literally hanging from the trees and glaring at me, so I didn't like that very much. I'll take my chances with a Bigfoot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I remember seeing a famous video that came out somewhere in the south with a guy fishing, and he was reeling in a fish, and then the next thing, this cottonmouth just appeared from nowhere and just basically has a tug of war with this gentleman over this fish he's caught.
Yeah, those things can get nasty with you. I mean, I remember canoeing it was sort of like a slough that went off of this lake, and I kind of noticed something in the tree, literally it was cottonmouths, and then I noticed they were just sort of gathered about on the edges, and they literally seemed to be looking at me and the other guy in the canoe, and just like, this is our area, get out. And we did turn around and get out of there. That was kind of creepy.
Yeah, that's one hell of a welcoming party.
Right.
So, obviously, the first chapter delves into probably, you may disagree with me, Lyle. I mean, obviously there are 2 or 3 that have a contender for this, but the Hockomock Swamp is probably most well known for being a well-established large portion of the very strange area known as the Bridgewater Triangle. Now, there's a fantastic documentary that's available. I'm not sure if it's still on Prime, but that was my first kind of introduction about 6 years ago to this particular area. Now, Hockomock seems to be the area that just seems to have the most variety of weirdness going on. We've got cryptids, we've got weird creatures, we've got legends, we've got ghosts, we've got UFO sightings. It seems to be all happening in this one area, Lyle.
Yeah, definitely. And Hockomock is one of those that I felt encompassed, the best variety and assortment of all the things that we were going to encounter in the book, from cryptids to ghost-like entities to prehistoric-looking birds, killer dogs, giant snakes, just literally everything, including the Pukwudgie, which is one of the spookiest type things encountered in anywhere in the book. And Hockomock is, as you say, the Bridgewater Triangle, which is located in the northeast portion of the U.S. in the state of Massachusetts. So, just sort of like as I collected reports and looked at the history, it just seemed to be the one that sort of could lead off the exploration into these sinister swamps.
Absolutely. And especially with the first portion of that particular chapter, because the first witness that you introduce us to is a gentleman called Officer Hadley, who has an extremely unusual experience one night that leaves him clearly terrified because he simply can't comprehend what he's come across.
Right. Yeah, there was, just starting off with that. I mean, this is something fairly recent. A witness I personally, interviewed. He was a correctional officer at a prison facility and had to drive through the Hockomock Swamp area after his shift late at night. And one evening, he was just driving along as normal. There's nobody on this, lonely road out there. And all of a sudden, up from the swampy area, he sees this dog-like creature run out and run in front of the car in full view of the headlights. And his description of this thing just doesn't quite fit any known canid or, from even a wolf or a hyena. It just is sort of a conglomeration of all of these sort of aspects of a four-legged canid. And he was just, not only frightened, but just perplexed as to what he had seen. And it just appeared 1 second out of the swampy bottoms and was there in front. Back in the 1970s, there had been some highly publicized accounts in the newspaper of what they called a killer dog that was loose in the Occomock area. So, it was good to talk to a modern witness that had seen this bizarre dog-like thing, and then to, look back at some of the, history that's gone on there.
Yeah, I mean, he does refer to it as well. I mean, he's very clear in the fact that he's telling us what he does for a living, and he's not a gentleman that scares easily. Working in a correctional facility, he's used to very intense situations, Lyle. So, and he gets a really good look at this thing. We're not sort of saying it's off in the distance. He says he reckoned it was about 10 feet away at one point.
Yeah, it ran pretty close to the car, and enough for him to kind of stop and gather his wits. Mm-hmm. And certainly he was I found him to be a great witness. He was descriptive and was serious about what he was reporting, and answering all of my questions, and in my opinion, certainly not making this up, and he wasn't looking really for any sort of publicity or anything. I was lucky to have talked to someone who had just happened to spoke to this person. So he wasn't out necessarily looking to report this. I just tracked him down, and it was a perfect example of the kind of things that materialize out of these swampy areas and then disappear, and extremely hard to pinpoint just what they are.
Yeah, because even if you look at the parallels with the Dogman phenomenon, even his witness report doesn't seem to tally with what other people say, because it, like as you say, it seems to be some kind of amalgamation of 2 or 3 different types, because I think he describes it looking like a hyena, but clearly not.
Right, yeah, it was definitely more of a, on 4 legs, a canid creature that doesn't really compare to the reports of the alleged dogmen, more of a werewolf or some canid that can get up on 2 legs or move bipedally. So this was something that, was not altogether monstrous, yet altogether strange and unidentifiable. And, obviously, again, not something exaggerated or made up. It just simply was something this guy saw that just was, searching for some explanation. And as most of these witnesses are, when they tell me of this, they're just trying to find somebody that will say, yeah, you're not the only one that's seen something like this. And he's certainly not.
And it's interesting as well, because he really does have an emotional response to this, which it's almost as if his body's reacting before his brain is.
Yeah, he was definitely emotional, and when he talked about this, you could tell it was something that affected him a great deal. And he probably no longer thinks the same way as he travels home on that route. What was once probably a very peaceful nighttime journey with no traffic, and you get to wind down from the obvious stress of working at a prison and to have to encounter that. It's like, oh man, now you just freaked out the guy's commute home, that was once peaceful. So this is what happens, beware the swamp.
Absolutely. Because I believe when the Europeans first arrived, they just called it Devil's Swamp, didn't they?
Right. And so many of these swamps have that kind of association from going back all the way to Native Americans. Oftentimes they had names associated with the devil or something else that were used to describe these swamps, or stories of fantastic or malevolent creatures that existed in and around them. So it wasn't just, it's not modern times. It's not just simply the European settlers. All of this stuff usually dates back to the very first inhabitants of the continent.
Yeah, because the natives clearly trekked the area with trepidation, but they also kind of had that eternal battle that we tend to see a lot in Native American legend and myth and storytelling, Lyle, where they're often advise you that you need to be on your guard and be careful of the dangers around you, but there are also the ability to benefit them in regards to, giving them animals for food and things like that. It's very much a yin and yang kind of experience that seems to have developed over the centuries from this area.
Absolutely. Swamps were a great source of, life for people who essentially lived on the land. And yet they had some trepidation about living in and near these places because of the potential dangers. The same things we fear. I'm sure they didn't, look at snakes, is any less dangerous than we do, much less alligators. And then whatever was the unknown, the strange lights or the ghostly figures or the strange creatures, they had to be careful and be aware of these places, yet they literally would often depend on the swamp for their survival.
So, obviously with Officer Hadley's experience, I know you mentioned it, but the other interesting aspect of that, which you then lead into, is this area, as you touched on, had some very strange reports about giant, ferocious dogs running about. And I think, was it in the 1970s, there was a gentleman who lost 2 ponies to this creature that was essentially looking as though it was chowing down on them.
Right. Yeah, that was back in the mid-1970s, and a firefighter that lived very close there to the swamp observed what he called a huge black killer dog standing over the body of these 2 ponies, and it had just literally ripped their throats out and killed them. And he fired at it with his gun, and the thing turned and ran into the woods. And from there on, it created this local frenzy and panic among the residents, and the police went out there and did some searches, and citizens were, on the lookout. And for some time, this dog-like creature, which they couldn't quite identify. Of course, some people just dismissed it as a German Shepherd or what have you, but the witness insisted that's definitely not what it was, and it was definitely bloodthirsty. So, they tried hunting this thing down, and, eventually it was just never seen again after it had been shot out a number of times, with no success in killing it. So who knows what it could have been, but it's one of those that did generate some newspaper coverage and just, was another, just added case in the greater weirdness of the Hockomock Swamp.
Because I think the last sighting before this flap kind of died away, because often this is the strange thing about these stories and witnesses, Lyle, they just seem to occur over a very intense period of time. It's like there's a lot happening for a few weeks, and then it just disappears. And I think, was it a police officer that saw it last and shot at it, and it just seemed to shrug it off and walk away?
Right, yeah. It was a police officer saw it wandering down a railroad track, and he fired at it with a shotgun not too far away, and it just seemed to be unfazed and turned and slowly walked into the woods. And from then on, presumably it wasn't seen again, or, the newspaper did not mention any further incidents.
It's almost as if it was just there for a particular period of time and has wandered off to pastures new. It's very peculiar.
Right. And, like a number of these cases, it's that same sort of frenzied flap that just happens, and there's witnesses, and the thing is terrorizing the citizens and of the area. And then, for whatever reason, it just seems to simply disappear or move on or whatever is the case. But, these are intense situations, I'm sure, and the witnesses seem sincere in their conviction, and there ends up being, it's just basically an unsolved mystery.
the aspect of them dismissing it and saying it was, a crossbreed between, I think, a German Shepherd and a Doberman. I think most of us have come across in our lives, Lyle, a large dog that's quite ferocious in some aspects. But these people clearly seem to be far more perturbed by what they were witnessing than just coming across a very angry dog.
Sure. I mean, we've seen, there are some vicious dogs, but usually they don't kill horses and other things. And again, I mean, even if it is a dog gone rogue and living in the swamp, it still becomes something creepy and monstrous that is able to hide in the swampy area. It just sort of emerges from the swamp shadows and disappears. And even if it is explainable in terms of biology, it's just the fact that this is what swamps will allow, things to hide and things to, emerge that are seen for a brief time and disappear back into there. So it's always sort of that, question of, what was it? What exactly was that thing? And was it a dog we know, or was it some hybrid or something even more unknown or undocumented? Who knows?
That's the thing about Hockomock. It just seems to throw things at you that are just so unusual that it really does leave you scratching your head. And I think my favourite story I've ever heard, and I've seen this gentleman interviewed previously, and so I was delighted to see that you'd had a chance to speak with him as well, is Bill Russo, who was out for a walk with his wonderfully named dog Samantha, which always makes me chuckle when dogs have really human names, which must be fun at the park on certain days, I would imagine. But Bill was taking a late night walk with his dog, as he usually did, I believe, and they never had anything unusual happen. He was a long-term resident of the area, and he stumbled across what eventually seems to be considered a Pukwudgie, which is one of those creatures that, unless you've really gone into that area, you kind of scratch your head and think, oh, well, it's probably a baby Sasquatch, or maybe it's just I'm sure people have said it's an escaped monkey, Lyle, as the usual case. But his experience is both chilling and unnerving because of the interaction he ends up having.
I can tell this is already a reader favorite, because many people have already messaged me and said thanks for the nightmares, especially with their description of the Pukwudgie incident. And this was one that I had looked forward to writing up myself, just in terms of it. It's a very cool and creepy, incident. So, and certainly a big part of Hockomock, because the creature that Bill Russo encountered, and basically one night when he was walking his dog, he came to a street where there was a sort of a street light with a bluish light, and he began to hear a strange sound, and all of a sudden this thing walked into the light, and it was a creature that was 3 or 4 feet tall, maybe only weighed 100 pounds. But it was upright on 2 feet, and it had big eyes. It was covered in hair. It had a distended belly that stuck out, and it looked kind of old, is what Bill Russo described it. And it was saying something to the effect of, "E want you, E want you, E want you, here, here." And it kept repeating this phrase. So it was frightening looking. It was speaking. And of course, this is something that, completely frightened Bill, and eventually he backed away and took off. And the creature he described is reminiscent of Native American legends of a creature called the Pukwudgie, which in their stories, it was a sort of a trickster or menacing type creature that lived in and among the woods and waterways of Hockomock Swamp, or the Bridgewater Triangle in general. And it was, it's sometimes hard to separate whether these are true biological creatures or purely fantasy or story type creatures, but nonetheless, it's just very odd coincidence that years later, Mr. Russo reported something like this, and according to Mr. Russo, he had never heard of the Pukwudgie. I mean, it's not something he even knew about. So not only was it frightening, but by the time he started looking up and trying to figure out what he had seen, once you discover that there had been legends of this, it's even more weird and bizarre and perhaps frightening. So that's one of the coolest, that story there. And Bill was interviewed in the Bridgewater Triangle documentary, and he's even written a book. So this is something that affected him in such a way that, he shares his experience, and he's been compelled to write a book. But yeah, certainly in terms of Hockomock, that was sort of the cream of the crop and the cherry on top, the creepy cherry on top in terms of wrapping up that chapter.
Very true. I mean, like I say, as you touch on there, Lyle, he was interviewed in the documentary, and he does the impression of because it's quite a high-pitched voice as well that he regales us with, and it really does make the hair stand up on your neck when he tells you this story, because there's lots of things about it that are very odd, like the fact that it just seems to be unable to come out of this light. It seems to be sort of wanting him to come towards it rather than it approaching him any further than it had already come out of the tree line, Lyle.
Yeah, that's the disturbing part, is it seemed to be in some ways trying to beckon him over there, and this strange language or whatever it was speaking, this Iwanchu, Bill later, theorized that it could have been saying, "We want you," and come here, or something like that. And so luckily he didn't fall for that, and he got out of there. But yeah, just one of those truly unexplainable things that falls somewhere between, I think that truly falls somewhere between cryptid, some sort of paranormal entity, or even some sort of extraterrestrial. It just sort of bridges the gap between the questions about all of those things. What exactly was this thing that he saw?
Yeah. Because it essentially changed his life, because and I think, if I remember correctly, he'd just decided it was a lovely evening, and he'd gone a slightly different way to normal. And it's one of those things, Lyle, that you just think, was he meant to go that way that particular night? Was it a situation that he couldn't stop himself finding himself in that situation, if you know what I mean? It seems unusual that he made a determination to change his route that particular day and ended up having this encounter that has changed his life, because I think, it's 30 years ago and it's still as clear as day for him.
Right. Yes. Who knows? It's like, it's one of those things that had that encounter not happened, there would never be any sort of second guessing as to why, as to changing the usual route of his walk or anything like that. It would have just faded off. But as soon as you have a significant incident like this, then you begin to question everything leading to that. Like, was I drawn here, or why did I see this thing? Why, as opposed to somebody else? And, all these questions that anyone who experiences something like this will probably ask themselves, especially if it's something like this that is just truly disturbing and frightening as much as it was to Mr. Russo. So I certainly understand his reaction to that, and to try to explain it with a book and all this other stuff.
Yeah, very much so. And it's interesting, I know you mentioned it in the chapter, Lyle, that the locals basically viewed the Pukwudgie in two ways. It's one of those legends that they have where it depends what mood these creatures are in, because sometimes they can be helpful and friendly, and other times they can be mischievous and quite dark-hearted, it seems. So it seems that the darker side of this legend seems to have developed further over the last century or so. So I found that interesting, that it seems to have gone from being a sort of, it depends what day it is, to being a more negative kind of experience in the modern era.
Right. Yes. I mean, there are characters that exist in the Native American tales that sort of have that, trickster type aspect where they can be friendly and helpful, and then suddenly, turn on you. So you never were quite sure as to the mood of these things. And, various, of course, as, the various factions of a tribe, or as the peoples share these stories, many people could include their own spin or their own experience with these and interpret them to be evil creatures or perhaps helpful creatures. It's just sort of anything in the world that we try to grapple with to explain, they certainly probably had the same challenges, is to try to figure out if something is good or evil, good or bad, and to make sense of it in the context of their world.
Yeah, I mean, Hockomock just seems like a very weird place, because not only have you got this going on, you've got witnesses who, people have been having experiences of large hairy hominids in the area for several decades, and we've even got reports of strange giant birds turning up there, as well as UFOs. So Hockomock seems to be a real nexus for the weird.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I mean, as one would naturally conclude that if it's part of something called the Bridgewater Triangle, anytime we have a triangle, there are many unexplained mysteries, such as the famous Bermuda Triangle and the Bridgewater Triangle. And as I attempt to establish in this book my own little triangle called the Caddo Triangle, which is based further south near Texas and Louisiana and Arkansas. But triangles just encompass weird stuff, and certainly the Hockomock is sort of the heart of one of these famous paranormal triangles that everyone is involved in. The research is just trying to find the explanations for.
Yeah, and I think that kind of leads me to the next area. So we'll return to the southern US, and probably one of the most infamous creatures mentioned in the book is the Honey Island swamp monster, Lyle. Now, to my shame, up until about 3 years ago, I'd heard a little about the Honey Island swamp monster, and I'd kind of, I wouldn't say dismissed it, but I was a little bit all right. And then I discovered In Search Of, which I'd never seen until about 3 years ago on YouTube, and all the episodes are on there. And one of the particular episodes, I think was from 1978, actually featured the Honey Island swamp monster. And my opinion changed after watching an interview involved in that. That seems a very strange creature, because once again you've got reports of unusual hairy upright creatures in areas that they are traditionally not supposedly to be seen in, but yet we have numerous accounts going back sort of the late 50s, early 60s in the modern era that gave birth and released the Honey Island swamp monster to the world. Right. Yeah, it's one that people have asked me about quite a bit. When am I going to write a book about Honey Island? Yeah. And I usually point out that I have discussed this previously in my book Beyond Boggy Creek, but that was only in terms of it being sort of lumped into the Sasquatch lore of the South, because that was a Bigfoot specific book. However, Honey Island Swamp and the Honey Island Swamp Monster don't quite fit into Bigfoot, as simply as that. So there's more to it. So Sinister Swamps, this book gave me the opportunity to cover the whole history of
the swamp and the creature, which has kind of become famous because it was featured on the In Search Of episode, and that kind of gave it a little more notoriety than just something that may have, been talked about in local newspapers, because obviously that was a, popular television show and many people learnand about it and can still watch it, the episode on YouTube. So, it's in the case of Honey Island Swamp, that swamp doesn't have as much just kind of general paranormal activity. Most of the history there is rooted in this creature that has been seen on many occasions, and it's described as being upright, covered in hair, walks on two legs. Some descriptions sound somewhat reminiscent of a Bigfoot or a gorilla, while others seem a little bit more, in my opinion, like Dogman or something. And then there's been some footprints that were found that allegedly were made by the creature, which are questionable footprints, but those looked sort of reptilian, which threw off the whole, gave it just this whole what is it type of reputation. But it's certainly one that the Honey Island Swamp is located way, way south on the very southern tip of Louisiana, right on the Gulf Coast. And so it is deep in the heart of Louisiana swampland, about a 45-minute drive from New Orleans itself. And so it's just one of those truly mystical, magical places that exists among the legends and lore of Louisiana, which include, voodoo, zombies, and a creature called the Rougarou, which is sort of a werewolf type creature. So Honey Island is one of my favorite cases.
Yeah, and it's interesting as well, because once again we've got reports going back to the late 18th century, Lyle, when the Cajuns and the French first arrived there, because I think they termed it La Bête Noire, the black thing that was lurking in this area, ready to take unsuspecting travellers who may have got lost or alone in this area. So it seems to have been a very well established legend, if you can call it that, because clearly in modern times it's become more noticeable in its kind of reporting. So that's always an interesting fact, that there seems to have been a well-established history to this creature before it got its modern sort of breakout, as it were.
Right. Yeah. Like many of these, you can trace back whispers of these to, people who've lived there all along, and, just the Cajun inhabitants having legends that sort of tell of this creature. And then it wasn't really until the In Search Of episode and some newspaper coverage and news coverage around the mid-70s that this story came out of the modern sightings, although what is looked at as probably is one of the first modern sightings occurred in 1963 by a witness named Harlan Ford. He and his hunting partner Billy Mills were going to a hunting camp out there and came upon this bizarre creature that was kind of crouched down and then stood up and ran off into the woods, and they tried to chase it but were not successful in catching it. So that was, according to Mr. Ford, that was 1963. And in the 1970s, some tracks were found, and he was interviewed more extensively about this, and that began to establish the modern history, which kind of dates back to the early 60s, although in my research I found a witness who had reported seeing something pretty close to Honey Island Swamp prior to that in around 1960. And then I interview a woman who had a very up close and dramatic sighting in the later part of the 60s whose story had never been told before. And she had come to me and shared this sighting with me.
Yeah, that's Des Crawford, isn't it, the lady?
Right.
Yeah, so she's on a trip with her family and needs to answer the call of nature, I believe, Lyle, which is fair enough, and suddenly realises that something is just watching her.
Right. Yeah, she was young at the time, and while she was out with her family, she was out doing her business in the woods and looked up and saw this hairy creature looking at her. And it was probably the distance of, I don't know, 20 or 30 yards. The sun, it was getting dusky out, but she had a great view of it. And she looked at it, and her impression of it was that it was a girl or a female gorilla, which seems bizarre even if there's a gorilla in the swamp. But that at the time was the best way she could rationalize it, because she wasn't aware of a Bigfoot or Honey Island swamp monster or anything like that. She just thought, well, it looks similar to a gorilla. And there was a noise that came from the camp, which sort of, startled the creature, and it turned and walked off into the woods. And that was the duration of her sighting. But it's something that she's lived with all these years. And as stories have come out about other witnesses seeing something in Honey Island Swamp, she saw the relevance in what she had seen, and of course surmises that she could have or probably saw this creature back in 1967. And she, in my opinion, is one of the best witnesses I've interviewed. She ranks right up there. Very thorough in the description, a very logical and well-spoken woman, one that's not looking for fame or fortune, and had not shared this story with very many people, because as it goes, people are reluctant to say these things because people will laugh it off. But she knew that I respect these type stories, and I'm not judgmental. So I took the time to visit with her on several occasions and correspond, and to try to get, document this story. So for me, it was very significant in that it's one that hadn't been told before, and it sort of added to the history of the Honey Island swamp monster.
Yeah, and it is interesting as well, because obviously, like, as we say, she was with her family. These were people who knew the area, went out a lot, so they knew the terrain, they knew the environment and the creatures that they would expect to come across. Because I think her family were convinced something had happened to her, because she was obviously very scared. But I think, didn't they come to the conclusion, oh, well, she must have seen a bear? But as she described, this thing seemed to have breasts, and it was a reddish colour, which, as far as I'm aware, doesn't seem to match a bear.
Right. As adults will tend to do, I mean, younger kids, they just humor them, I think. Oh, you saw a gorilla in the woods, well, there's no gorillas here. It must have been a bear. But that's one thing she was certain of. She said, it's not a bear. There's no confusion there. She knew what a bear looked like, had seen bears at the zoo, plenty of pictures of bears. She absolutely knew the difference between a bear and, say, a gorilla-like creature. And it did have what appeared to be breasts, and giving the obvious impression it's female, but again, something that differentiates it from a bear. But yeah, I can be almost certain that what she saw wasn't a bear. She was confident about that.
I mean, the other interesting aspect of Honey Island is, and there's a connection with one of the other chapters I'll mention in a bit, is one of the witnesses was a gentleman called Ted Williams, who I think came forward after the In Search Of episode, because he'd had experiences and he'd seen this creature several times in the previous decades, I believe, Lyle. And he's one of those perplexing cases where you think, brilliant, here's another witness that we can interview. But I believe Ted decided to go out into the swamp one day and was never found again.
Right. Yeah, that there'll be no interviewing Ted Williams because, yes, he literally disappeared into Honey Island Swamp, and which is odd because, I mean, he lived there. He knew the swamp. I mean, he wouldn't be one to be lost out there. So who knows what happened? That's the, the dangers of swamps, and even the most seasoned person who knows his way around can become lost or succumb to any number of dangers, which perhaps it was the creature, but we would never know because he did not live to tell the tale.
Yeah, it's just something mysterious about when somebody's, and like you say, here we have an experienced gentleman who knows the area, has been visiting it for years, and then one day he just vanishes. But, as you say there, Lyle, it's a swamp. There are plenty of things that, if the mood takes them or you let your guard down, you could come a cropper with them.
Certainly, and that, I find those disappearance cases fascinating, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Later in the book, I discuss in detail some strange disappearances where people, were in these swampy areas, the Everglades and other places, and simply disappeared. So definitely swamps are a place where there's a lot of missing persons cases.
I mean, it obviously was interesting as well. I think that the other aspect of all this was obviously Harlan Ford's granddaughter, Dana Holyfield, has carried on this tradition. So it's very clear that whatever happened to Harlan really has affected his family all the way down, because here we are 60 years later, and his Dana and her father, Dan, I believe, have really spent a lot of time investigating and following up witnesses in regards to this. So here we are 60 years later, and the third generation of the family are carrying the torch on for him.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dana is sort of, she is the point for, gathering information and research on the creature, and something that she has carried on, obviously from the experiences of her grandfather and her father and other members of the family and neighbors. So, she's sort of what I am to Boggy Creek as far as being known for that research. She's certainly the Honey Island gal, and is somebody that I enjoy speaking with and I've visited with when I've gone down to Honey Island.
Yeah. There's some really good witnesses, though. It's really interesting because, like I say, when I first heard about it, I was a bit, But the more you find out about it and the more you read, it becomes quite compelling, Lyle, that there clearly is something weird going on there.
True. And, that's what I say about a lot of these cases is that, we can't quite explain what it is. There's no proof that there's a unknown creature, but, I certainly have no doubt that people have experienced strange things and have seen things there that they just simply can't explain. And so that's the question that remains is, just what is this thing? What is this phenomenon that's taking place? And, what may live and lurk within that huge swampy area?
Yeah, very true. Very true. It's compelling stuff. It really is. And as we touched on there, the disappearance of Ted Williams kind of leads me to the final chapter I'd like to dive into with you, which is wonderfully entitled Green Hell. As we've mentioned, there's a particular area which is known as Devil's Creek. So yet again, here we are with an area which seems to have some kind of significance in regard to hell or the devil, or which seems to be one of those things that when you start looking at certain cases and certain incidents, Lyle, things like devil and hell seem to turn up quite a lot. So it seems that these areas are well named.
Yeah, I think so. And, I kind of took the title of the chapter, I called it Green Hell, just in reference to terminology used to describe the Amazon at times in the past. And so while no no swamp in North America quite compares to the Amazon. Obviously, there are places that, offer enough danger and hellish conditions that one could become lost in there and find themselves in their own hell. And certainly to add to that, the places that are named, Devil's Swamp or Devil's Creek or anything like that obviously carries sort of an ominous atmosphere about it, and you wonder why in the world it was called that in the first place. What happened there, what was experienced by the people that came and settled those areas for them to call it, instead of Bubbling Creek or something. It's, it's Devil's Swamp. So, it's like, that something must have gone down here. So I thought this was, a good way to collect some of the swamps that sort of had that hellish vibe or devilish vibe, and discuss a little bit about the naming of such places.
Yeah, because there's several notable ones, because obviously there's Seven Devil's Swamp, Tate's Hell, Devil's Den. I mean, it just seems as though these areas seem to attract these negative names, and when you look at these cases, they are clearly very well titled, because once again, as we touched on with the curious case of Ted Williams, there's a very similar incident where once again we have someone who is very experienced, knows the area, goes there a lot, a gentleman by the name of Charles Huff, who just vanishes. Nobody knows where he's gone. I think his wife came home and discovered he wasn't there, and then the search begins for Charles, and it seems to create more questions than any answers we could possibly find, Lyle.
Right. I mean, there's many cases like that where, seasoned individuals just succumb to the dangers of the swamp. And in this case, Mr. Huff was a hunter and was, just going off for a short hunting trip and never came back, and resulted in a considerable, hunt for him that turned up nothing. It was no trace of him was ever found. Mm-hmm. And this is in the, an area where, obviously people have and do disappear.
Yeah. And it's one of those cases, Lyle, even the beginning's very peculiar, because I think his wife, who came home and discovered he wasn't there, was aware that he was going to go into the swamp the following day, and she'd basically said, "Don't go on your own." I think he'd arranged to go with a partner that he usually went out with, and she came home and discovered his gun was missing, but he'd also got some chicken out for tea that night, which obviously clearly gives you the impression that he wasn't planning on not coming home. He'd prepared. He'd started the preparation for dinner, Lyle. So that alone adds a whole new facet to that, where you're thinking, well, why on earth has he decided to make this decision? Because I think within a couple of days, his car, or his truck, I believe, is found at a location that his partner suspected he would have gone to.
Right. Yeah. I mean, by all indications, he didn't plan to go out and camp overnight or any such thing. Just sort of a evening trip and return for dinner, in fact. So, that's what spread the initial alarm is, he should have been home. And so the next day they organized a search, sheriff's office and rescue dogs and all that sort of stuff went in there and tried to pick up his scent. They did find his vehicle, and even knowing where he entered the swamp with trained, seasoned search and rescue, they still could find no trace of him. I mean, and they searched and searched until, as in some of these, they just simply call it off because there's just no results. They've seemingly vanished.
Mm. Yeah, there's another aspect of this as well, because I'm sure a lot of people will be aware of David Paulides' work in 411, and there is often a situation that occurs in these disappearances that once again appears in Charles's case, where on the night of his disappearance there's a massive storm comes through the area, which essentially cleanses any kind of trace of him, because there's a really intensive search for him for 10 days. I think they've got 200 people looking for him, Lyle. They're out macheteing through the wilderness. They've got tracker dogs. They've got air scanning. Not a trace, not a footprint, not an item of clothing. It's as if he literally gets out of his truck and just disappeared off the face of the earth.
Right. And, with the 411 cases, there's just some of these that just defy explanation. I mean, certainly people can become lost, and the swamp has many places where people could, collapse and be hard to find. But when you've got, huge search and rescue, 200 men, you've got dogs and all this other stuff, it's, unless this guy just managed to hike a really long way, which he probably didn't. He was an older guy. I mean, he's just really not going to go very far back into the swamp. You don't need to anyway. And, and then all the stuff with how it happens in many of these cases where a storm rolls in right after they go missing and things just leads to speculation, that what kind of weirdness is going on. And, in this case, I looked at cases that were associated with some of the swamps that I was including in the book. And not coincidentally, these are the swamps that have huge amounts of paranormal activity and all sorts of weird stuff going on, and monsters and ghosts and what have you. So the fact that somebody goes disappearing into a place like that, you'd certainly wonder what could be going on in there, and what could this person have encountered,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even, I'm sure most people say, oh, well, animal attack. But, animal attacks, such as a gator or something of that regard, usually leave something, be it blood or ripped clothing or, in certain cases, a floating shoe or something, Lyle. And it's as if something's just come and cleaned everything off, and there's nothing there at all. And it's intriguing as well, because as you lead up to that particular part of the book, I know you mentioned Robert Robinson's very strange experience that happened in the area, and there seems to be once again reports of a large hominid in the area that has been reported over the last 20 or 30 years again, Lyle.
Yeah, certainly the Green Swamp there in Florida is one that is highly notable for what's called the Skunk Apes, the southern Bigfoot, and many reports have come out of there. My colleague and fellow author Rob Robinson, has been up into that area and has experienced some weird stuff firsthand, as well as many of my fellow researchers that have gone there as well. So it's certainly a place that is, high on the list of possible areas where the skunk ape could be existing and exist in somewhat the remoteness of this Green Swamp, because it is just a tangled and, rugged place.
Yeah. I mean, the skunk ape is one of those, I think most people know it from the infamous picture that was captured. Now, regardless of because people have always dismissed it. I mean, I've seen people say it's an escaped orangutan, as usual, even though it seems to look more like the picture, in my opinion, looks like a cross between an orangutan and a baboon. It's a very unusual looking creature, and whether it was a hoax and somebody tricked this, because I think it was a lady that caught the picture in her back garden, I believe, Lyle, was it?
Allegedly.
Yes.
The authorities never actually talked to the lady, and I actually covered that in my Beyond Boggy Creek book in the Skunk Ape chapter. And yeah, I mean, it's just a weird photo, and it's one that's become pretty much associated with the skunk ape, though the photo is in no way been proved to even be a skunk ape. So our vision of what a skunk ape is, if it's based on that drawing, could be incorrect. But nonetheless, I mean, the skunk ape has a very long history of sightings, all in the area of Florida, which includes some of the swampy areas that I discussed, Big Cypress Preserve and Everglades and the Green Swamp, and then on up into Georgia, Okefenokee area. But certainly just too many reports to dismiss the whole thing out of hand. I mean, people have seen some kind of ape-like creature down there. We just yet don't have a body to confirm exactly what that creature is.
Mm-hmm. I think, and out of the traditional heartlands of Bigfoot, it does seem to be one of the most widely witnessed and reported as well, Lyle, because as you say, I've seen numerous people claim to have captured footage of coming across strange-looking creatures in the area. There's numerous films on the internet that you can find if you go on YouTube, and I think there's one from 2 or 3 years ago with a guy who just was having a hike and stumbled across something mucking about in the roots of a tree as though it was digging for something, which, let's be honest, could have been a very elaborate hoax. But he seems, if he's acting, I think he's wasting his career, shall I say? Because his response to what he finds is very compelling, Lyle.
Right. Yeah, I find that to be one of the better videos that is definitely hard to just dismiss right off. And that was a swamp in Mississippi where that guy saw it, and which is all part of that Gulf Coast region that spans from Louisiana, Mississippi, covers some swamps in Alabama, and then on down to Florida at the southeast tip of the U.S. And all that area there has just long histories of sightings of these creatures, and people would be very surprised to learn that Florida has probably ranks, I think it's like third or something in number of Bigfoot type reports, coming out of the U.S. It's just one that's a huge hotbed of sightings. So, certainly fits into the scenario where I'm discussing swamps that have activity. Every single one of them in that area has some history of skunk ape or Bigfoot-like creature sightings.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people are a bit surprised because of the temperature of Florida. I think a lot of people would just assume that, surely a large hairy creature can't possibly live there because of the heat. But if we know anything about Florida, it's that creatures who don't normally live there seem to absolutely love it, a bit like tourists.
That's right. I mean, I think if I was a Bigfoot, I would probably want to live in the Pacific Northwest, but if I did take a vacation, Florida would be the place to go.
Absolutely.
So it's not completely surprising that vacationing hominids are occasionally seen in Florida.
Stranger things have happened. Though I suspect it's probably more a very unusual population they've got there, because it seems anything flourishes in Florida regardless, wherever it comes from in the world, Lyle. We only, we look at the terrible situation they've got there with the boa constrictors and rock pythons down there, and then you've got all, what else have they got? I mean, they've even got cane toads. They've got African rats that the size of small cats. Oh, it's it's one of those places you just think, I'm glad I'm just visiting, because I've visited Florida. And yeah, keep them. You're all right, thanks.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the situation with the Burmese pythons that are non-indigenous to the area that have gotten loose, those things have just multiplied. They're huge, and they have the potential to literally swallow small humans whole. I mean, no joke. And so those become huge concerns. And like you say, these things run off into the wilds of the Everglades in Florida, and they just love it. And it just becomes a great place to settle and to have a family. And then that creates these huge problems for the ecology and the environment there. And that's something they are always dealing with. I think skunk apes in some ways are the least of their problem because there's not as many. There's just mini snakes and, things like that are causing more immediate problems.
Absolutely. And I think for anybody's benefit, if the skunk ape has a diet based on large snakes, I think everybody would be happy to keep the skunk ape rather than the snakes, I think, Lyle.
Right, yes. That would be much to its benefit if it could claim to have helped the environment in that way and control the population of snakes. The skunk ape would suddenly be a state hero for Florida.
Very true. Well, rather than spoil any more of the book for anybody who's yet to buy it, fantastic, Lyle. It's a really wonderful travel around the US. As I've said, for somebody like myself who wants to go to many of these places, though you've certainly put me off a couple as well. In a good way, of course, not through your book, but obviously what goes on in these locations. It's a fantastic addition to your excellent library of work so far, Lyle. And I know you've got a couple of other irons in the fire coming up, because I believe you're doing some more work with the Small Town Monsters. Have you been just finished wrapping the Mothman Legacy, I believe?
Yes, I just did my narration track for our upcoming documentary, and we're excited about that as a follow-up to our popular Mothman of Point Pleasant from a few years ago. So, yeah, that should be coming out soon. So, yeah, it's just been a lot going on, even though a lot of events and book signings that I would normally have done have gotten canceled, but there's always something else to be doing or researching or to complete the films and things. So I've stayed busy, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been one of those strange situations that on face value you could possibly get really quite frustrated, but I suspect for a man such as yourself, Lyle, it's probably given you a bit more time to kind of focus on other projects and spin a couple more plates.
Yeah, in many ways it has. I mean, I've got usually more to do than I can ever do, so there's always something that I can do a little adjustment and work on this instead of that, if that's the case, and if I'm flexible. So, there's been some issues. I mean, even just getting books to fulfill orders from my website and things I've noticed a slowdown and turnaround just getting books from the printer and from my various publishers and things, but that's understandable. And thus far, I've been able to keep up with the demand, and certainly people seem to be enjoying Sinister Swamps. So I'm quite happy with the response and that people have been even ordering it. It helps when I can't get out there to do book signings and things, as people can still get them in our modern world and delivered, in the mail. So.
Well, absolutely, and I recommend it highly. It's as I said, it's a wonderful addition to your library. I mean, as soon as you mentioned it, when I spoke to you last, I was like, right, I'll keep my eye out. One of those, and obviously you're one of the authors I follow on Amazon, so as soon as I got the ping to tell me I could pre-order it, I was straight in. Right, let's get that sorted. So, congratulations, it's a brilliant book. I recommend it highly, Lyle, so congratulations. I'm sure you're very pleased and proud of it.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate you reading it and having me back on the show.
Hey, anytime. So, where can everybody keep up to date with your upcoming work and get themselves a copy of the book and your other works, Lyle?
Well, you can always find out all the information on my website at lyleblackburn.com, and my books are available there on my store link, and you can get autographed copies from me, and you can even get copies of the Small Town Monsters DVDs and other items. And you can also find my books on Amazon. It's available in paperback and Kindle editions, and is on most all the Amazon. So if you're a UK resident, you look on your particular Amazon and it should be there. And definitely appreciate all the support.
Yeah, anytime. It turned up in 3 days, so I recommend it. Anybody in the UK who's worried about it turning up, I got my copy in 3 days after it was released, Lyle. So that just testament to how good they can do it.
Well, that's really amazing. I think you're getting them faster than I can get them. you're a priority.
Well, I don't think it's anything special, Lyle. I think.
I think it's because if you order one, it's quick. If I order, 50 of them to fulfill orders, they're like, oh, this is going to take a few weeks. So, there's a difference there. But, it is definitely shipping. And it's great that there is a distribution chain where somebody can order it, that far away and get it in a few days. Really cool.
Absolutely. Well, just before I let you go to the rest of your day, how's the band? Have you finally been forced back into the studio?
Yes, we are working on some production of the new album, and we're actually about to launch a crowdfunding campaign, sort of a pre-order thing for the new album to anticipate whether people want CD or vinyl LPs or just what format and things like that. So that's another thing that if you follow me on my website, there's links to my band Ghoultown, and certainly hit me up on Facebook and other things, and you can find out all the news about the books and the music.
Brilliant. Well, listen, always a pleasure to have you. Thank you again for coming on for your third appearance, Lyle. So I appreciate it as always. And I will look forward to whatever you've got coming up and await it with bated breath. So thank you again for your time, my friend.
Absolutely. Thanks.